Welcome to a podcast about leadership, a program dedicated to helping you unlock your leadership potential, presented by AIIR Consulting. I'm your host, Tom Fox. Today, we welcome Jamie Ramsey, founder and chief executive of AIIR Consulting, LLC, and a former CEO with 25 years of international business experience. Jamie is an elite coach who works with Fortune 500 C-suite clients, business owners, and entrepreneurs worldwide to drive transformative change and achieve sustainable results. Additionally, Jamie is the author of the upcoming book, Let's Go! How Great Leaders Shape the Future, which is set to launch in May 2024. Jamie, thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And I'm excited to talk to you today because, changes happening all the time.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to focus in today about leaders, how they really navigate dynamic environments of change. And what really even got me thinking about this is I was rereading our AIR Leadership Trends Report for 2024. And one of the observations was a nice little tidbit from HBR, the new normal of change, that even before the pandemic, 68% of business leaders felt overwhelmed by the rapid pace of change. And it says it's got three dimensions. It's perpetual, it's pervasive, and it's exponential. And that seems to be change for us, in our current environment. And, as you're out there coaching folks, how have you seen change kind of really filter through with leaders?
Yeah, I think, and I spoke about this in the AIR webinar that we had around this. I think the current environment is the pace of change is even changing. So the pace of change is changing. And so, there's fragmentation in the workforce. We've got hybrid. We've got organizations trying to figure out return to office policies with varying levels of clunkiness and disapproval from employees. One of the things I said there is 9 out of 10 CEOs and HR departments are preparing for return to office policy by the end of the year, and 9 out of 10 employees are not looking forward to that, are not prepared for it, right? They're not coming back into the office. And so we've got this real reckoning that's going to happen. There's a dynamic tension that's going to happen, which, 20 years ago, when I was a chief executive, you didn't even have to think about this. So we're having conversations now that we would have taken for granted. And so as with any change situation, right, we've got disruption, we've got some distractions, we've got fragmentation, we've got, technology that is really, shifting people's perspectives. And also there's this sort of underlying sense of, cynicism maybe is too strong of a word, but sort of dissatisfaction with work and the work-life balance. We were promised a while back that technology would kind of free us up, and it feels like the opposite has happened. And so that's the context that we're in right now, right? Trying to make sense of the world in what is a very, what would probably be seen in human terms as a very disruptive moment.
That's a perfect word, human, because leaders are human. And you know what? They have to lead other humans.
Yeah.
And there's all these complexities that come into not only just navigating change for ourselves as a leader, but also looking out across the organization, looking out across our entire lives. Like, it's always a state of flux. And, I'm curious, especially in your work as a coach and things like that, and really helping people navigate these things. How have you seen leaders effectively balance agility and decisiveness while ensuring they address those fundamental needs? Things like self-awareness, community, meaning, and purpose in these dynamic environments? Because to your point, they're always shifting.
Yeah. And I think there's something about, in great times of change, that calls forth for a greater leadership, right? That's typically what we're looking for. If we can manage the status steady, then, a good management or good systems can carry you through. But in times of change, and I think about either sort of, if you're whitewater rafting, right, you need a different set of intensity, a different set of tools, a different set of focus, and maybe even a guide than if you're just lazily going down the river on an inner tube, right? And so, Abigail Adams, I think, who was the wife of John Adams, said, great necessity calls forth great leadership. And so, talking about the times of the American Revolution. And so in a way, we're in a time of revolution. We haven't quite understood haven't had time to even process. There's technological disruption, but the COVID, the way that COVID impacted the way that we interact. And so the tools that leaders are going to have at their disposal are going to be different. And so my frame of reference has always been, and it's in the book that's coming out in May, it's always about the 4 dimensions of leadership, which is the individual, the team, the context, and the future. Those are four dimensions of leadership that have persisted through time. And that leadership is necessary through those lenses. And so people are looking for leadership. They're looking for leaders to help them navigate through change in four separate ways. They're looking for them to help them understand themselves, what their values and principles are. They're helping them to feel a sense of belonging. How do I feel
Mm.
connected? And this is something that has really, truly been disruptive when we look at the diseases of despair and sort of social fragmentation. But the sense of belonging, who do I belong with, and how do I get that basic human connection, this desire for human connection that's persisted through time? Then there is, a sense of meaning. So somebody help me figure out what is going on. What does it mean for
Yeah.
me? And then a sense of purpose or a sense of direction, particularly a sense of direction in times of change. And I say that people, are going to resist change. They don't fear change as much as fear being changed. There's a difference between if I decide I'm going to make a change myself, right, then just try and stop me, right? But if you impose change upon me, then most people's natural reaction is to resist. And so leaders are having to do the double work because they're having to understand themselves. They're having, to your point, having to use different tools to create connection amongst that group. And they're having to understand or make sense of the world in a way where the interaction is causing us or is asking us to spend more time thinking about the organization and the construct. But actually, leaders need to spend more time thinking about what comes next. And so you could very easily fall into a trap of dealing with today or dealing with your team, understanding yourself and not looking into the future. So all four of these dimensions are critical,
Mm.
particularly this idea of what comes next. And I think there was a report I saw, a piece of research that said 60% of 6-year-olds will in 20 years time have jobs that don't exist today.
I
I don't know
easily
how
believe that.
I don't know how they figured that out, but that was a piece of research. But it's entirely possible if you think about the people that exist today, the jobs that exist today that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so that's requiring what? It requires reskilling a different mindset. It requires adaptability and flexibility. And so to answer your question, very simply, what leaders have to do, there's a chapter in the book that talks about performance, preparation, and recovery, right? And if I think in Darwinian terms, right, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent, it's the most adaptive that's going to survive or going to
Yeah.
thrive, right? And so leaders have to be thinking about what is my opportunity? Like the performance piece would be our default setting. So performance is I'm interacting with the world in order to develop or drive results and get an outcome. But what we can lose in that is how do I get my team resilient and prepared? There's a lot of talk about resilience, and there's a lot of talk about being flexible and
Yeah.
adapt. But how can you train for that? How do you train for that? And that to me is the work of leaders, as well as providing the opportunity for recovery that's not the sort of end of the day or the weekend, but actually recovery in the moment, in the day. And so a lot of times when I'm working with C-level folks, I challenge them. I say, we need an hour a day for you to sit and reflect. And when I say that, they look at me like I'm crazy, right?
I was gonna say, even I was just like, wow, an hour. Jamie, I ain't
Imagine
got an hour of my day. But if Grandma Fox used to say, if you don't have time, we make time, especially
you've
for
got
those
to
things
make
that are
time.
important.
Exactly. You have to make time. And so how do you do that? And so that requires a different level of, it's funny because the temptation when the world is looking like it's disruptive and chaotic and it requires us on the front edge of action, right? It requires us to be active. Actually, there's even more of a requirement for leaders to be able to sit and be reflective and to sit and think about how does my team work? How does this organization going to evolve? What's happening? Like, where is the puck going to? Not where is it today? And so making time to be thoughtful and intentional and strategic is actually even more at a premium when we're thinking that we actually have less time or we're seeing that we have less time. And so the challenge that I always have is we've got to create that time. We've got to make that time so that you can think about how do I build resilience in my team? How do I build resilience in myself? How do I model the behaviors? How do I, sell and tell a compelling story about where we're going? But most importantly, how could I find out what's going to come next? And that can only come with
Yeah.
pulling in inputs from the outside in and then reflecting upon those and trying to see the connection between the dots and where your organization or your industry or your clients or your competitors are going.
But this is also where I can see the benefit of someone working with someone like yourself saying, Jamie, I got to figure out all these things, but Let's
Yeah.
say they're a leader from a different generation. I was from the command and control generation. Hey, Tom, we're going to change. Well, what if I don't like to change? We'll find out. I mean, that was
Yeah.
it. Go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But now it's to your point, we're digging down, we're thinking more about, how do I create this sense of community? How do I give my people this sense of purpose? How do I, and these are things we didn't talk about in the workplace, I'd say 20 years ago and things like that.
Indeed.
So this is fertile ground, so to speak. So I can see the benefit of someone just reaching out to, hey, Jamie, I need a coach, man. I got some of this going on in my head, but how do I structure this? How do I, to your point, I have to tap into resilience in myself, but then I
Yeah.
also have to cultivate that resilience across my organization. Let's say my senior team first, have them push it down to the organization. So this doesn't happen overnight. And that's something probably we should, just touch on in general. Change itself takes time.
Yeah.
It is not a set it and forget it, and we're going to change next Tuesday and it's going to be great.
Right.
There's some, to your point, it's got to be thoughtful. We've got to think it through. And then we also have to realize too that, and as you mentioned earlier, some people may be resistant to change. It's not their aspect of just being resistant to it, but this is stuff in the brain. We're hardwired for this stuff
Right.
because, we're human beings and we're
Yeah.
these wonderful constructs. But there's certain things I think to your point that if a leader takes that time to think about, they could really make a tremendous difference in guiding those people forward. That's
Mhm.
pretty cool.
Yeah, and so, what does that mean? It typically, so if I talked earlier on about the three legs of the stool, prepare, perform, and recover, but also the benefit or the value of a flexible plan, right? So, because if we're in a changing environment, we're going to have to communicate consistently. So, there's this storytelling aspect of every great leader has a storytelling capability,
Mm,
and how they do that can be different, but they have this ability to be able to create a narrative that people can, is compelling and also make sense of the world. But also this idea of communicating how the plan, what the plan is to start with, and then maybe how the plan changes over time. And I just thought of this morning, just thinking about the change. Imagine being a pioneer, right, from 200 years ago, going from east to west, right? Somebody
mm,
has to be able to help explain, like, what are we prepared to anticipate? Like, what has happened today? Like, what is making sense of that? How far are we on the journey? How do we make sense of the things that happened to us on that journey? And how do we maybe pivot based on conditions that are around us that we can't control, as well as the conditions of the people who are making the journey? And so I think about, the leaders today have to sort of adopt that mindset, which is I need to keep on communicating effectively with my organization. The primary one being is that, we have a flexible plan. This plan will have to flex because if we stick to it rigidly, circumstances will teach us a lesson that, may be very, very costly. And so it's just this idea of telling the story. What are we trying to accomplish? What's our direction and what's our purpose? And then how are we going to navigate the difficult circumstances that are going to happen along the way? And now in today's world, it just feels like those circumstances are shifting more than maybe they did 20, 30 years ago. And so the leader's responsibility is to ensure that the team is, apprised and aware of what's going on around them.
You remind me of the old, give us the why behind the what.
Yeah,
Why are we doing this?
right.
And giving people context. And I forget the way it was said, but the more people understand, the easier it is for them to come along with things, keeping them in the loop, getting them
Mhm.
involved, even sometimes asking for their feedback about things. And to your point about change, if we're in the midst of change, the one thing that's pretty guaranteed is we're probably going to have more change. So to
Mhm.
your point, we can't have a static plan like, okay, this is our 3 point change plan. Without there being some flexibility in there, because what if something happens? And listen, if you look at the environment we're in today, things happen all the time, little
Yeah.
things, big things, but they could influence your change. And as a leader, then it's kind of be like, to your point, be a little flexible. It's funny. You make me think then, with all the wonderful people you've worked with, do you have some examples about how leaders have adapted their leadership approach to prioritize some of these changes, being mindful of their people and helping them navigate through this?
Yeah, so a lot of times, particularly leaders in transition, there's a common or constant I see around this. So if you're moving into a new leadership role, you're going to be very likely to, if you're sort of driven and ambitious and motivated and a type, sort of action-oriented person, your initial default is going to be a change agent. Like, I'm here to bring change. I'm here to impose change. And you might bring the playbook from where you previously worked, or you may do a 90-day tour and then decide what your change is going to be. But it really is this concept of, I'm going to enforce change or I'm going to impose change. And again, what typically happens, or what can happen, is if you haven't thought it through, is that there's resistance internally
Yeah.
to that change. And that, back to my point, the resistance to being changed, not to change. So in that case, you haven't given people a compelling enough reason to want to change, back to your point about the why. And I talk to people about, well, that's a push, a change agent will use a push strategy, a
Yeah.
push modality, but a pull modality, if you were to approach that and see these two things as just not an identity as a change agent, but the way I would describe it is the benevolent disruptor. So we're building a
Yeah.
coalition. We're helping to sell and tell the story, right? We're taking time to understand why are things done the way they are inside the organization, and then building resilience and adaptivity and capabilities for what's coming at us from outside the organization. And so, a benevolent disruptor will do that. They will say, okay, what is the change that we all need to, affect ourselves so that we're better prepared for what comes next? A change agent will typically push and push and push and feel resistance and then push harder. And that can end in very unpleasant results. And I see that quite typically. And so a lot of the
Mm.
pivots that I'm getting folks to work with, or I get my leaders to work with, is to take on this idea of being a benevolent disruptor, which is, yeah, sure, we're going to look different by the time we're done with this, right? Some of it will be internal and some of it will be externally driven. But if I haven't built a coalition of people who understand what we're trying to accomplish, and I simply just push and impose change upon them, then I'll lose members of the group. I'll lose historical knowledge. I'll lose capabilities. And then I have to replace it. And then that takes energy that I could be focused on
Mm.
adapting or evolving to external circumstances. And so that's one of the things that I think I've seen leaders, I've seen them pivot. And I help them to pivot into thinking about what is necessary change that needs to happen shortly. Because sometimes you do have to go in, right? If there's a crisis, you do have to stand on the chair, speak loudly and firmly and coherently. You have to stand up and lead. But there are times where you can sit down and follow and just listen to the organization and see where the organization is heading. But there are other times where you need to be declarative. And so it's understanding that those are not identities, those are modalities, those are approaches that you can use. It's tools that you have in the toolkit that will allow you to build a more resilient and adaptive team.
I mean, it sounds very much like leaders who act as coaches using push and pull
Mhm.
strategies to
Yep.
help develop their people, to
Yep.
connect with the magic inside them, to help draw it out, using those tools in different ways to do that. But it sounds like just kind of leveraging that in a different way. Let's put it from a leadership perspective. How do I look at this holistically through all my people? And listen, in all organizations, there are probably going to be some people that are, let's go with the change. Amen. I'm ready to go. Some people are going to be like, tell me a little bit more about this. And some people are like, I ain't going nowhere. But if we sit there and we to your point, and even if we can even get on the chair in that aspect of change, but as long as we tell people, give them a little, pull back the curtain. Here's why we're changing. Here's the thing. Here's some of the benefits. Here's what we're all going to experience as part of this change. It just sounds like you point that narrative coming out and really just helping people go, oh, I get that. Because people are going to be asking the questions anyway.
Mhm.
And if you don't answer the question for them, they're going to fill it in with just about anything that pops in their head based on their own experiences or whatever it may be.
Sure.
So it sounds great that you're able to get leaders to look at it a little bit differently. It almost sounded like the leaders jump in a problem solving mode. I'm here to
Yeah.
do something, so I'm going to start doing it now. Whereas
Right.
opposed to like, great, we got this issue, concern, whatever it may be. Let's learn first, and then once we have all the data, facts, whatever it can be, then we can go into problem solving mode. Sounds like the same thing here. Let's pause first, leadership wise, and then how can we affect change?
Mhm. Yeah, and so in leadership terms, that's the two modalities will be challenge and support. Like that's typically the modalities that we would think about internally. Like how do I challenge the team or challenge an individual or challenge the organization? And then how do I
Yeah.
support it? So those are the push and pull modalities. But also under this framework, it's really interesting because you separate it into three groups. And I get people to think about the three groups because typically, especially if you're a new leader, there are a certain number of people who will love you because of, because of
Yes.
who you are and what your title is. There are certain people who would dislike you for the same reasons. And there are a group who will be in the middle and say, well, let's just wait and see. And leaders can typically either focus on the group at the one end of the scale, which is they might surround themselves with the people who say what they want to hear, but they're losing 2/3 of the organization. Or they might focus on, I need to win people over, and I'll find the most dissenting voice. So they go to the other third, and they forget that there are
Yes.
2/3. And so what I get people to think about is assume that there's that third of people. Identify the group of people who are already on board. right? They can believe in you, they can believe in who you are, what credibility you bring to the role and your role. And then focus on what I call the floating majority, right? Because if you get this third and you can get this group of people who are saying, well, let's just see, and you can speak to that group and get them to come on board, then suddenly we have a 2/3, and that's enough to create change. And you have to
Yeah.
sort of sometimes just, not dismiss, but sometimes like contextualize some of the challenging voices. Certainly my experience, when we moved our organization from bad to good over the course of 18 months, there are still voices that are going to say, this isn't going to work. You're not doing it right. You've made a mistake. You're not the right person. And that, can feed into imposter syndrome that most people will experience. But if you can focus on what do I need to do? What's the coalition I need to build inside the organization to affect change? And using these two modalities of push and pull, then what you'll see is that things will happen, quicker than you could ever believed. But you have to take a different approach. Most people would take the approach, I'm going to push, I'm going to drive change, I'm going to be
Yep.
the force of change, I'm going to be the agent of change. Instead of saying, how do I build the coalition for change? And then I facilitate change, the necessary change inside my organization.
I mean, it reminds me of the essence of leadership. Leadership's not about dragging people, screaming and whatever it may be. It's about helping to guide them, helping to understand the benefits, not only to the organization, but to each of us as agents of the organization, what this all means for our clients and the work that we do, our careers. So it really is. That's why, in thinking about it, as you're talking about, I love the coalition approach. And even as you build those coalitions, I'll ask you this question. Would it be good to put a couple of dissenters on the coalition only because you might find out that they flip because
Yeah.
they're surrounded by all these other folks and they kind of fill in the blanks for them. And now imagine that. Now you set up this coalition of people that are in the middle and really behind. And if you have a couple of folks in there from that resistor and they start to just flip naturally, that's got
Mhm.
to be interesting as well. Like, do you have people
Yeah.
set up different types of coalitions really help
Yeah,
those?
so it's,
those
when I talk about building a coalition, it's a concept, right? It's a conceptual approach, right? There would still be dissenters in that group. And if I think of Abraham Lincoln, who, for me was always one of the best presidents that America ever had, he had a team of rivals, right? There's the book that they wrote about, The Team of Rivals,
Hmm.
where he would deliberately and intentionally have dissenters in there. And I think you do need that because you need people to pressure test some of your ideas, right? You have to make sure that you're not in an echo chamber. And so, yes, you have to bring people in, but you have to make sure that you're differentiating between the noise and the signal, right? So, what are they saying that's constructive and helpful and productive to us? And what is simply either somebody who's reacting so badly to change that they can only see the downside, and or somebody who's actually helping us to think better and to fail faster and move quicker?
I mean, this sounds like, when it comes down to the leader, there's a lot for them to consider. And there's a lot for them to be mindful of.
Hmm.
So to your point, it's not just about coming in and let's bulldoze this chain. It's
Hmm.
about coming in and saying, all right, let's plan this out. Let's instead of going to bulldoze and make the street right away, where's the street going to go? What's going to be
Right.
up? Where the sidewalk? We figure all this out. Now we've got a plan. Next
Yeah.
thing you know, we're building a great city.
Exactly. And
Uh,
so this aspect would come back to this idea of sometimes just taking a lot of times I'm spending with folks is the idea to say, okay, does this need to be fixed right now? I'm just trying to get my leaders to pause because if you look at the calendars, they're back to back. If you look at the conversations, they're intense, right? If you look at the change environment that they're in, all of these things can drag you or they can bring you to the conclusion that you have to act immediately. And
yeah.
so if you're in a crisis or if there's something terrible that's happened, yes, you do, right? But I think that most leaders think that that 70 or 80% of their time should be commanding, driving, directing. And actually, with a bit of time and some thought, typically over the course of the engagement, we get them to be operating in that mode only when it's necessary, which could be 10 or 20% of the time. And the rest of their role is about facilitation. It's about unlocking the potential in others, which is really hard to do if you're central to the performance of the team. It's really hard to do if you're front and center of all activities because people don't have the opportunity to showcase their skill. And so we're back to this concept of maybe being, the servant leader is a concept that came out in the 70s and it's back in vogue in many ways. I think the command and control cannot work in the current, because we have hybrid, we have fragmentation, we have people who don't buy into it. It's not an effective model for today's world. And what we're looking for are teams of teams that can adapt, they can change quickly, they can get information around, and they can collaborate differently from how they have in the past.
But this sounds a little bit like a different skill for a leader, so to speak. One of the things I was thinking about is how they can cultivate a sense of community and belonging. But it really sounds like one of the best ways is to take a step back at least with all this, is to take that step back first and to get a full sense of the change, the breadth of it, get an understanding of the people around you. And once you are informed by that, it sounds like then you can make those moves. And to your point, the command and control, I worked with a lot of those leaders, worked for them, worked with them.
Yeah.
Um, it
Yeah.
is struggle sometimes,
Yeah.
especially through times of change, because you want a little more clarity, because you want to be a good representative of your organization, do the best by your clients. But if you're not understanding the change yourself, it's very hard as an individual to advocate that to customers, clients, whatever may be out there in the marketplace. So,
You can still be decisive without being a command and control leader.
oh yeah,
So what
absolutely,
you're talking about
absolutely.
is this idea of people, people are seeing uncertainty. They're looking for clarity. They're looking for certainty. They're looking for decisiveness, right? And so you can still provide that as a leader without being a command and control leader. It's just the question of the sequencing of the decision and the inclusivity that happens before the decision is made. But still, at the end of the day, the buck stops on your desk. So, the buck stops with the leader. And so, being aware of that and being able to respond to that in a way that's maybe feels different from the past, but it's not, is when it's done well, great leaders will unlock the potential of the people around them. They'll facilitate success in their teams and in their teams.
That's amazing. When I think of command and control, it goes back to what an old mentor say. Command and control to them was, if I wanted your opinion, I'd give it to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is, like I say, that mentality. I mean, it still exists to some degree, but I mean, to your point, it's not. And where we are today, that's not always the best way to lead, so to speak.
In crisis, in certain situations, yeah, we do need
Yeah,
somebody to,
got to
like I
step
said,
back.
to stand up on the desk and to give us our directions and to speak firmly and loudly. Yes, sometimes in the crisis, but the majority of the times we're not in crisis, or actually we can compound the situation if we act like we're in a crisis. If we start to push and we get directive and we're blunt and we don't take into consideration the secondary or tertiary impact of our decision making, that's when things can get out of hand. But it's really understanding, like if you were to sit inside any leader, any CEO's shoes, if you looked at their calendar, right, and you saw the world that they had to inhabit, you'd think that they have to operate at a super high pace. And the idea that we're working on when we work together is, how do we get your team to take care of most of the day to day? And actually, this isn't just with CEOs, but most of the people I work with, we focus on how do we architect some infrastructure around you so that you can extract yourself, because the gravity of the organization will pull you down, right? The speed of events happening around you will pull you into the details. It will pull you into the weeds if you're not intentional about it. And so what we do, and typically when I'm working with people, first things first is to architect some space into their day, week, month, year. And when we have that space, then it's to take the step back and say, how can I think at an enterprise level in a way that I haven't in the past? Operate at a level that may have lots of zeros on the end, that wouldn't be seen if I wasn't doing this work, because ultimately that is the responsibility of the CEO. It's not to actively and highly efficiently drive into a brick wall that nobody saw coming.
Mm.
Sometimes you have to slow down and take the corner. And so if you're not leading, if you're not seeing that coming, then you're doing a disservice to your organization and everybody pays the price.
As you look towards the future, what other skills do you believe that leaders should prioritize, as they look at dynamic environments and they continue to evolve? One of the big takeaways, take a moment to pause, from our conversation. But what other skills,
Yeah.
think leaders need to kind of really be mindful? Either there could be in their mind about working on now, or as you see in the future, in 2 years from now, we're going to need to know how to code AI. What are some of those things they should be like, I got to really bone up on this?
Yeah, I think I always think about like the skill sets, the skill sets will evolve. I think it's the mindset, maintaining the same mindset that's important. And
Mm.
for me, there's four things that I think that leaders have to keep in their mind, as busy as the world around them gets, or as challenging as the situations can be. So number one, we talked about sort of building resilience and adaptiveness within your team consciously and intentionally. But how do I prepare them to perform so that I don't have to? How do I prepare them or give them the opportunity to recover and do the same myself, model that behavior so I perform, I prepare, and recover? Secondly, is the development of a flexible plan. So just understanding what's the flexibility, what's the core things that we have to have that are non-negotiable, but what's some of the things that we can pivot or we can move away from based on updated circumstances. The third one really is about how you communicate. Are you telling a compelling story? Are you telling the story and helping people make sense of the world? And certainly when I was chief exec, I'd say 60% of my time was in sense making. It's a great opportunity when someone walks into your office and says, hey, we have a problem. And that problem could be competitors launched a product. It could be our client is unhappy. It could be somebody in my team is not playing well with somebody else. That is an opportunity for you to reinforce values, to make sense of the world, to simplify complexity. And so it's understanding that those opportunities shouldn't be lost. And typically when we're moving at light speed, we don't take those opportunities. But that reinforces culture and it reinforces connection. So it's communicating and telling stories. And then finally, the last one, which is sort of if you got the rest, then this one would be about how do you find the edge? How do you disrupt yourself from the inside out in order to protect you from being disrupted from the outside in?
It's so wonderful stuff. I know you've got the book coming out soon. Let's Go: How Great Leaders Shape the Future. This has been a wonderful conversation. When people pick up the book, can they continue this in their own mind, so to speak, as they read through this book? They'll be able to get some other, beyond this, even just beyond change. What are some great things that people are going to be able to experience as they go?
Yeah, so the book is based on each of the 4 sections is based on the 4 dimensions that I talked about. So role model is one thing, is a leader's the capability that leader have to show. And so we have a role model, we have a community builder, we have a sense maker, and a future shaper. And those are the 4 roles that a leader has to play, right? And those have been true throughout time. Right? When I did my research 20 years ago, I literally looked at leadership throughout history, and leadership not just in corporations, but in communities, right? And in all kinds of different areas. What is common to all leadership? And it's those 4 dimensions, right? But then in each of those sections, so we have 4 sections in the book. In each of those sections, then we have 10 chapters that are really just thought pieces. They're just a little thought piece. They're not more than like 1,000 words. It's a page or 2 pages. And it just is an idea or a concept that you can read, close the book, think about how it applies to your own world, go for a walk, and then hopefully it will give you some kind of insight. And so you may not like all 40 of those chapters, but there's certainly 1 or 2 that are going to resonate for you based on, your age and stage, your time and place. And so, there's the model, and then there are the chapters. And I'm hoping that people will get something out of one or the other.
I know I'll be picking it up and definitely get some of it myself. Where can I get the book? Where can our listeners get the book from?
Barnes and Noble, Target, Amazon. If you're in the UK, Waterstones, WH Smith.
Awesome.
Most common retailers will have them. Yeah, it's published by Harriman House, and it comes out on May the 14th, 2024.
Oh, fantastic. That's Let's Go: How Great Leaders Shape the Future. Awesome.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, listen, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your wisdom and just really the conversation. I hope our folks get a lot out of it, especially the aspect of, changes sometimes about slowing down the speed up. Once we have the understanding of what we want to do, then we can move forward.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a real pleasure being here today. Thank you so much.
And thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated to future episodes. To discover more about AIR, our leadership framework, and how our leaders to navigate change and shape a better future, we invite you to explore our resources and insights. Visit us at airconsulting.com. That's AIIR Consulting.com.